Stalingrad, a single name that reshaped the destiny of nations. In the summer of 1942, the world had already bled for nearly 3 years. Hitler's blitzkrieg had torn across Europe, crushing Poland, France, the Balkans. The Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow the previous winter, only to be beaten back by frost, fury, and desperation. Yet the Führer was undeterred. The war in the East, his war of annihilation, was far from over. Now his eyes fixed on the south, on the oil fields of the Caucasus, the black veins that fed the Soviet war machine. But between him and that prize stood one city. A city carrying not just Stalin's name, but the pride of his people. To take it would be symbolic. To lose it would be catastrophic. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was more than bricks and factories. It was identity. It was resolve. Stalin declared it would not fall, no matter the cost. And the cost would be unimaginable. Here, the German Sixth Army, one of the most formidable forces on earth, would march with confidence. Here, the Red Army, bruised, battered, but unbroken, would dig in with teeth and nails. It was not merely a contest of soldiers. It was a collision of ideologies. Nazism versus communism. Fascism versus survival. The scale defied comprehension. Over 2 million men would fight in this single city. Tens of thousands of civilians would be trapped in the inferno. Bombs would fall like rain, turning the skyline into blackened skeletons. Entire divisions would vanish within days. Hunger, cold, and disease would kill almost as many as bullets and shells. This was not war as the world had known it. This was urban slaughter. Close-quarter combat. Snipers whispering death from ruined towers. Knife fights in stairwells. Flamethrowers scorching basements where men clung to life. The battlefront shrank to meters, sometimes inches. Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, because soldiers crawled, stalked, and killed like animals inside the rubble. But beneath the chaos, larger forces moved. The Germans pressed forward, confident in victory, until the trap began to close. Soviet generals plotted in the shadows, preparing a counterstroke that would stun the world. In the frozen steppes around the city, a tide would rise, encircling the hunters, turning the hunters into prey. Stalingrad was not just a fight for ground. It was a test of will, a battle of endurance, a struggle where the line between victory and extermination blurred. When it ended, the world would be altered forever. Germany would never recover. The Soviet Union would emerge bloodied but unbowed, and the fate of World War II would tilt. This is the story of Stalingrad, the bloodiest battle in human history. A story of fire and ice, of men ground into dust, of dictators gambling with millions of lives. A story where hope flickered, perished, and was reborn. And it begins with fire raining from the sky. The summer sun blazed across the endless Russian steppe. Dust clouds rose behind columns of German armor, snaking eastward like steel serpents. The Wehrmacht, undefeated and confident, pushed deeper into Soviet soil. A year earlier, they had come within sight of Moscow, only to be beaten back by the coldest winter in memory and a Soviet counterattack that rattled Hitler's dream of swift victory. But the Führer was not finished. Moscow could wait. The Caucasus, with its rivers of oil, was the new prize. Without it, Germany's war machine would wither. With it, the Reich could fuel a global empire. Yet on the map of conquest, one name loomed large, directly in the path of this grand southern offensive: Stalingrad. The city was more than geography. It bore the name of the Soviet leader himself. To capture it would be a dagger into Stalin's heart, a propaganda triumph to rival all others. To lose it for the Soviets was unthinkable. In July 1942, Army Group South split its forces. Field Marshal Wilhelm List pushed toward the Caucasus oil fields. Meanwhile, the task of capturing Stalingrad fell to General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army. Paulus was methodical, obedient, but untested in command of such magnitude. Behind him stretched one of the finest fighting forces in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of men, panzers, artillery, and the Luftwaffe above. Their advance was unstoppable. Or so it seemed. As the Germans surged east, villages disappeared in smoke. Soviet defenses crumbled before the relentless tide. The Red Army bled, retreating, regrouping, then bleeding again. Civilians fled with what they could carry, others conscripted to dig trenches, or left to starve along the roadsides. The Wehrmacht seemed destined to roll straight to the Volga. But the march was not without shadows. Supply lines stretched thin across scorched earth. Heat scorched the German columns, dust clogged engines and lungs. Partisans ambushed convoys, tearing at the arteries of the invasion. And always the Russians fell back but did not break. In Moscow, Stalin watched with cold fury. He had issued Order 227, not one step back. Any retreat without orders was treason. Soldiers would face death from their own side before surrendering the ground beneath their boots. To enforce it, barrier troops stood behind the lines, ready to shoot deserters. The Red Army would hold, not because it wished to, but because it had no choice. By late August, Paulus's men reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. From a distance, the city stretched along the western bank of the Volga, sprawling with factories, smokestacks, and workers' housing. It was an industrial fortress, vital to Soviet production and morale. To Hitler, it was the keystone of the Southern campaign. To Stalin, it was sacred. Neither leader would yield. The fate of the city, and perhaps the war itself, was about to be decided. The Germans tightened their grip, preparing the blow. The Soviets dug deeper, ready to bleed. The stage was set for an inferno unlike anything in human history. And when it began, the sky itself would burn. August 23, 1942. The day the earth shook. The German Sixth Army had reached the gates of Stalingrad. For weeks, they had marched through the steppe, driving back the battered Red Army, crushing what remained of Soviet defenses in the south. Now, Paulus prepared to deliver the final blow. The advance was spearheaded by panzers, their engines roaring like predators unleashed. Columns of tanks tore across the plains, kicking up clouds of dust that blotted the horizon. Behind them, infantry poured forward, disciplined, relentless, efficient. The German machine had rolled across half of Europe with this same rhythm. Stalingrad, they believed, would be no different. The Soviets tried to halt them. Hastily assembled divisions, poorly armed, poorly trained, threw themselves in front of the advancing juggernaut. Entire regiments were annihilated within hours. Soviet T-34s clashed with panzers on open ground, burning in black columns of smoke. Still, they fought because retreat was death. As the Sixth Army approached the city, the Luftwaffe descended from the sky. Waves of bombers roared overhead, their bellies releasing fire. High explosives and incendiaries rained down on Stalingrad. Within hours, whole districts disappeared in an apocalyptic firestorm. Streets cracked with heat. Wooden houses vanished in flames. Stone buildings crumbled. Civilians, trapped in basements, suffocated as flames consumed the oxygen. The German pilots watched from above as the city turned into a burning ruin. To them, it was victory assured. Paulus's soldiers marched toward the smoking skyline, believing they had already won. Stalingrad, reduced to rubble, seemed defenseless. But rubble has a strange way of fighting back. Within the chaos, Soviet defenders prepared themselves. Soldiers dug firing positions in the ruins. Snipers climbed the skeletal remains of factories. Civilians joined the war effort. Women hauling ammunition, children carrying water, old men repairing rifles. The city itself became a fortress, its destruction turning streets into trenches, buildings into bunkers. Meanwhile, the Volga River remained the city's lifeline. Across its waters, reinforcements streamed in, under constant bombardment, under withering fire. Men disembarked straight into combat, often without rifles, told to pick up weapons from the dead. Yet for now, the Germans pressed forward. Their lines extended deeper into Soviet territory, their confidence unshaken. Hitler himself demanded the city's capture at all costs. His obsession turned Stalingrad into more than a military target. It became a personal vendetta. But obsession has consequences. The German advance grew reckless. Supply lines stretched thin. Fuel and ammunition struggled to keep pace. And though the Soviets bled, they never stopped coming. As the sun set over the burning ruins, the Sixth Army dug in for what they believed would be the final assault. Paulus's men were certain, tomorrow the city would fall. But Stalingrad was not merely a city anymore. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. The real battle was only beginning. August 23, 1942. The sky above Stalingrad screamed. At midday, the Luftwaffe arrived, not in dozens, not in hundreds, but in thousands. Ju-87 Stukas dove with their infamous wails. Heinkel bombers droned overhead in endless waves. The air vibrated with the hum of destruction. It was the largest aerial assault the city had ever seen. The first explosions tore through Stalingrad's northern districts. Then, like dominoes, the rest followed. Warehouses, homes, train stations, obliterated in seconds. The bombs fell so thick that daylight dimmed beneath the smoke. Shockwaves rattled across the Volga, tossing ferries like toy boats. The river itself seemed to recoil. For the civilians, there was no escape. Mothers clutched children as buildings collapsed around them. Basements became tombs. Fire consumed entire blocks in minutes. Survivors crawled from the wreckage only to face suffocating smoke and flames leaping from street to street. The city had become a furnace. German pilots, circling above, radioed back with triumph. The city is gone. From the cockpit, it seemed true. Stalingrad was reduced to rubble. Entire neighborhoods vanished under a rolling wall of fire. An estimated 40,000 civilians died within hours. Paulus's Sixth Army marched behind the storm, believing the Luftwaffe had cleared their path. Burned-out ruins stretched before them, silent, smoldering, lifeless. But appearances deceive. Inside the rubble, the Soviets endured. Soldiers staggered from cellars, coughing black soot, their uniforms scorched, their faces streaked with ash. Commissars barked orders through the chaos. Civilians, those who survived, were pressed into service. Women dug trenches. Teenagers carried ammunition. Firefighters battled flames while artillery thundered above their heads. The city, though burning, refused to die. The bombing had destroyed Stalingrad's streets, but in doing so, it created a labyrinth of rubble, perfect for defense. Collapsed buildings became barricades. Craters became foxholes. Every shattered wall offered cover. What the Luftwaffe thought was annihilation became, instead, a fortress of ruins. Still, the air raids did not stop. For days, Stalingrad trembled under ceaseless bombardment. The Luftwaffe tried to burn the city into submission, to crush morale before the Germans even entered. But the Red Army held, and the Volga remained their lifeline. Across the river, under artillery fire, ferries brought reinforcements. Men crossed knowing they might never return, stepping straight from boats into burning streets. The civilians who survived learned to live in darkness. They cooked in cellars, drank from puddles, and prayed as the ground shook above them. For them, survival itself was defiance. To Hitler, the city was already his. To Paulus, the Luftwaffe had made victory certain. But inside the smoke and rubble, something fierce was forming. The Soviet defense was no longer just about holding ground. It was about turning ruins into weapons. And soon, the Germans would learn the truth. Rubble fights harder than stone. The inferno had begun the battle. The real slaughter was about to start. When the flames finally dimmed, Stalingrad was unrecognizable. Where there had once been avenues and factories, there now lay mountains of rubble. Smoke clung to the skyline. The scent of ash and death mixed with the metallic tang of molten steel. Survivors staggered through the ruins like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their clothes scorched. For those who lived through the inferno, the city itself had become a prison. Tens of thousands of civilians were still inside. They could not flee. The Germans encircled from the west, the Volga raged to the east. Bombed bridges and burning ferries meant escape was almost impossible. Families crowded in basements, sharing air with soldiers, clutching what little food remained. Hunger gnawed quickly. Wells were poisoned by corpses, bread ran out within days, and rats became a grim staple of survival. And yet, in this hell, the Soviets refused to evacuate completely. Stalin ordered civilians to remain. Their presence served a brutal purpose: to remind soldiers that retreat was not an option, that the city was still alive, that surrender would mean not only defeat, but betrayal of their own families. German patrols entered the outskirts cautiously, rifles raised, expecting silence. Instead, they found resistance. From the ruins, bullets cracked. Snipers, hidden in chimneys, water towers, and shattered apartments, fired without warning. A soldier paused near a collapsed wall, and suddenly he was dead. The rubble had eyes. The Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Fighting was no longer about sweeping maneuvers or grand strategies. It was stairwell against stairwell, basement against basement. A single room might change hands 4 or 5 times in one day. Grenades bounced down hallways, machine guns rattled through door frames, knives flashed in the darkness. Death came from every corner. Inside the city, civilians adapted to this nightmare. Children carried messages through sewers. Women reloaded rifles for snipers. Old men bricked up firing positions with their bare hands. A factory worker might spend the day repairing a tank under bombardment, then pick up a rifle at night to guard a street corner. Stalingrad itself became a soldier. Meanwhile, across the Volga, reinforcements kept coming. By night, under the cover of smoke, ferries shuttled men across the river. Some crossed clinging to planks, swimming under artillery fire. Many drowned before even setting foot in the city. Those who survived landed on a shoreline littered with corpses, and from there, they were thrown directly into battle. For the Germans, the frustration grew. Paulus's men had expected an easy occupation, a city already dead. Instead, they found a nightmare that swallowed entire battalions. Progress was measured in streets, in buildings, in single staircases. The more they pushed, the more they lost. Still, Hitler demanded victory. Still, Paulus obeyed. The Sixth Army pressed deeper into the ruins, convinced that the Soviets must eventually break. But the opposite was happening. The deeper they went, the tighter the Soviet grip became. Stalingrad was no longer just a battlefield. It was a trap. And in the weeks to come, it would close like a fist. On July 28, 1942, weeks before the firestorm consumed Stalingrad, Joseph Stalin issued a decree that would become infamous. Order number 227. Its words cut like steel. Not one step back. No retreat. No surrender. Any soldier who abandoned his post without orders was a traitor. Any commander who authorized retreat without direct approval was a criminal. Behind the front lines, NKVD barrier troops were stationed with machine guns. Their purpose was not to fight the Germans, but to shoot their own men if they faltered. Stalin understood his army was fragile, battered from months of defeat. He chose to bind it with fear. For the Red Army soldier, Stalingrad was no longer a battle for survival alone. It was survival under the eyes of two enemies, the Germans in front and the NKVD behind. Retreat meant death. Standing meant a chance, however slim, at life. The order galvanized the Soviet defense. Morale was brittle, but discipline was now unbreakable. Commissars read the decree aloud to assembled units, some soldiers listening in silence, others with clenched fists. There was no choice but to obey. Even as shells fell, even as comrades vanished in clouds of dust, the line would hold. And so, Stalingrad became a fortress of resolve. General Vasily Chukov took command of the city's defense. Hardened, ruthless, and pragmatic, he embodied Stalin's decree. "We will defend the city or die in it," he declared. Chukov understood that fighting the Germans in open battle was suicide. Instead, he dragged them into the ruins, forcing close combat where Soviet numbers, ferocity, and desperation could level the playing field. Under Chukov's orders, Soviet troops fought at point-blank range, hugging the German front so closely that artillery and air strikes risked hitting their own men. "Cling to the enemy like a coat," Chukov told his soldiers. It was brutal, but it worked. Factories became fortresses. Every wall bristled with rifles. Snipers hunted across broken skylines. Small Soviet detachments launched night raids, crawling through sewers, slipping across shattered streets, striking suddenly, then vanishing back into the darkness. Order 227 was not just punishment, it became a grim kind of pride. Soldiers carried it in their pockets, stained with sweat and dirt. They muttered its words as they fixed bayonets. Families trapped in basements whispered it when bombs fell overhead. For Stalin, Stalingrad was more than a battlefield. It was a symbol. It bore his name. To lose it would be unthinkable. To win it would mean the Reich could bleed. He would not yield an inch. The Germans advanced, building by building, street by street, expecting collapse. Instead, they met resistance everywhere. Sometimes in full battalions, sometimes in a single sniper's bullet. The Soviets refused to vanish. The order had taken root. Fear had fused into defiance. And the city, though shattered, stood. But holding Stalingrad came at a terrible price. Reinforcements had to cross the Volga under fire, ferries shattered by shells, men drowning by the dozens. And yet they came, endless waves of men ferried into a furnace, armed with nothing more than Stalin's command. The Volga became a river of blood. And the longer the Soviets held, the more the Germans were drawn into the labyrinth. The trap was tightening. Night on the Volga was never silent. The river, wide and black, shimmered under artillery fire. Shells whistled overhead. The water erupted in geysers of foam and flame. For the men of the Red Army, crossing this river meant stepping into hell. On the eastern bank, staging camps buzzed with urgency. Exhausted recruits, many barely trained, were herded toward ferries, barges, and fishing boats. Some carried rifles. Others carried only ammunition. Many had nothing at all. Their orders were simple: cross the river, fight, and hold. If you die, another will take your place. The crossing was a gauntlet. Searchlights swept the waters. German artillery zeroed in on the boats. Stukas dove from the sky, their sirens shrieking. Wooden barges splintered under direct hits, bodies spilling into the current. Men clung to planks, kicking desperately against the current as flames lit the surface of the water. The Volga swallowed them without mercy. And yet, the ferries kept coming. Hour after hour. Day after day. Entire divisions were fed into the inferno one boatload at a time. The river became a lifeline, and every crossing was a sacrifice. On the western bank, the landing zones were no safer. German gunners fired relentlessly at the shoreline. Men leapt from boats into waist-deep water, wading through mud as shells burst around them. Many fell before they even reached the ruins of the city. Those who survived found no respite. They were thrown immediately into combat, often without proper orientation. Some had no rifles. Stalin's factories could not keep pace with the need. Commissars ordered them to follow their comrades into battle and take weapons from the fallen. The war turned grotesque. A man's survival depended on another's death. Despite the horror, the flow never stopped. Reinforcements streamed into the ruins, and with each new wave, the Soviet defense hardened. Fresh troops replaced the fallen. New snipers joined the hunt. Engineers brought mines and flamethrowers, setting traps in factories and stairwells. For the Germans, the Volga seemed like an open wound that refused to close. They tried everything, bombing ferries, pounding the river with artillery, tightening the noose around the landing zones. But every night, under smoke and darkness, more men crossed. It was as if the river itself conspired against them, feeding Stalingrad's veins with lifeblood. The cost was staggering. Thousands of Soviet soldiers never made it across. Their bodies floated downstream, tangled in reeds, washing ashore days later. Yet the survivors, hardened by the crossing, fought with ferocity. To them there was no way back, only forward. The Volga was both their bridge and their prison. Once inside the city, retreat was impossible. General Chukov relied on this relentless flow of men to keep his defense alive. Each morning he counted his losses, each night he prayed reinforcements would arrive. And they did. Not enough, never enough, but enough to keep the city from falling. In Stalingrad, soldiers spoke of the Volga with reverence and dread. It was not just a river. It was the thread of fate, binding them to the city. Its waters carried death, but also salvation. By September, the Germans had expected to crush the city. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that multiplied with each passing night. The Volga defied their efforts. The Germans could burn Stalingrad to ash. They could bombard the factories to rubble. But they could not stop the river. And as long as the Volga flowed, Stalingrad would not die. By September 1942, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a carcass of concrete and fire, a place where the living walked among the dead and every corner reeked of smoke, blood, and decay. Yet within this graveyard, the Germans advanced, and discovered they had entered a new kind of war. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, France in mere months. They were masters of blitzkrieg, sweeping across open ground with tanks, aircraft, and coordinated strikes. But in Stalingrad, blitzkrieg died. The ruins of the city swallowed tanks whole, turning avenues into traps. Craters and rubble clogged the streets. Snipers lurked in every window. The Germans were forced to fight, not in sweeping maneuvers, but in inches. The battle became Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Each street was contested. Each block was a fortress. A single building might be stormed 5 times in a day, seized by Germans in the morning, reclaimed by Soviets at night. Grenades exploded in stairwells, machine guns rattled through shattered doorways. Soldiers crawled through holes blasted in walls, emerging suddenly in enemy-held rooms, bayonets flashing in the dark. The Germans pressed forward with discipline, but their advantage in firepower meant little. Flamethrowers scorched basements, only for Soviet fighters to emerge from the rubble behind them. Artillery pounded positions into dust, only for defenders to rise again from the craters. The city itself fought back. Factories became fortresses. The Red October steelworks, the Barikady gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant, once symbols of Soviet industry, were now citadels of resistance. Workers had fought on their assembly lines until bombs silenced the machines, and then they picked up rifles to fight in the ruins. The Germans advanced into these giants of steel and brick, only to find themselves ambushed in mazes of twisted girders and broken walls. For the Soviets, there was no retreat. Chukhov's orders were absolute. We hold the city, or we die in it. Small groups of soldiers clung to ruins with astonishing tenacity. A dozen men with rifles could hold up an entire German battalion, forcing them to expend time, ammunition, and blood for every yard. The fighting grew so close that Soviet and German soldiers sometimes occupied different floors of the same building. Voices echoed through ceilings. Grenades were lobbed through holes in the floorboards. Rats, driven mad by the constant bombardment, scurried between corpses and living men alike. For the Sixth Army, the battle became a nightmare of attrition. Progress was measured not in miles, but in meters. Every gain came at staggering cost. Units were chewed to pieces, their replacements fed into the same grinding machine. The city that Hitler had promised would fall in days was devouring his army. Still, the Germans fought on. Pride, orders, and Hitler's obsession drove them deeper into the ruins. Paulus could not retreat. The Führer demanded the city at any cost. And so the Rat War consumed both sides. Soldiers lived in the ruins like animals, scavenging food, drinking from shell holes filled with rainwater, sleeping in rubble alongside corpses. The line between hunter and hunted blurred. Survival depended on instinct, ferocity, and sheer endurance. By October, the Sixth Army had captured most of the city's western districts. Yet the Soviets still clung to the riverbank. They refused to yield. The Germans had taken much, but not enough. And in the ruins, the defenders sharpened their claws. The bloodiest phase of the battle was only beginning. In the ruins of Stalingrad, death often came from silence. The Luftwaffe had reduced the city to rubble, and that rubble gave birth to shadows, perfect hunting grounds for snipers. Broken walls, shattered chimneys, and hollowed-out factories became nests of death. From these perches, unseen eyes watched. A soldier exposed his head for a second, and a rifle cracked. The street claimed another body. The Soviets mastered this dark art. They turned the city into a sniper's paradise. Among them rose names that would echo through history. chief among them Vasily Zaitsev. A shepherd from the Urals, Zaitsev arrived in Stalingrad with nothing more than his hunting skills and iron nerves. In the city's inferno, he became a legend. Zaitsev stalked the ruins with patience. He and his comrades blended into rubble, disguising themselves beneath debris and smoke. They chose their positions carefully, inside water tanks, under floorboards, even beneath corpses. Hours passed without a shot until the perfect target presented itself. Then a single squeeze of the trigger, and another German fell. Zaitsev was not alone. Soviet command encouraged snipers, creating entire schools of sharpshooters. Women joined the ranks, proving equally lethal. Each sniper became more than a soldier. They were symbols of defiance, psychological weapons as potent as bullets. German soldiers grew terrified to move, afraid to light a cigarette or raise binoculars. In Stalingrad, visibility meant death. The Germans countered with their own marksmen. Trained sharpshooters from the Wehrmacht and elite hunters from the Waffen-SS arrived to duel with the Soviets. The most famous clash, whether myth or truth, pitted Zaitsev against a supposed German ace, Major Erwin Koenig. For days, legend says, the two stalked one another in a deadly game of cat and mouse among the ruins of the factory district. In the end, Zaitsev triumphed, his bullet striking through Koenig's scope. Whether fact or wartime propaganda, the tale captured the essence of the rat war. Survival through cunning, patience, and nerves of steel. For the ordinary soldier, the sniper were meant terror at every step. Streets became gauntlets. Courtyards were killing fields. To fetch water or carry ammunition was to risk an unseen shot. Men crawled on their bellies, hugging rubble, darting from shadow to shadow like hunted animals. At night, they listened for the faint scrape of metal, the whisper of a rifle being moved. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers wrote in letters, "We fear the shadows more than the shells." Artillery could be endured. Machine guns could be avoided. But the sniper was invisible, patient, inevitable. Snipers reshaped the tempo of battle. They slowed German advances, pinning troops behind cover for hours. They gave Soviet units breathing room to regroup, rearm, or launch sudden counterattacks. In the maze of ruins, a single well-placed sniper could hold off an entire company. By late autumn, the Germans realized Stalingrad was not a city that could be stormed. It had to be bled, inch by inch, under the eyes of men who could kill without warning. And yet, for all their skill, even the snipers could not change the larger tide. The Germans still pressed forward, and the Soviets still clung to the riverbank. Both sides suffered unimaginable losses. Both sides bled. But high above the ruins, in the headquarters of the Red Army, new plans were forming. Plans not to defend, but to strike. The hunters of Stalingrad had bought their comrades time. And soon, the city itself would become a trap. The heart of Stalingrad was not its houses or avenues. It was its factories. Giants of steel and brick that once thundered with machinery, churning out tractors, guns, and tanks for the Soviet war effort. Now, those same factories became fortresses, their machines silenced, their walls shattered, their furnaces cold. Yet inside their ruins, war continued with a new, savage rhythm. The Germans, advancing deeper into the city, sought to capture these industrial behemoths. The Red October steelworks, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant stood along the riverbank like wounded titans. To Hitler, they were trophies. To Stalin, they were lifelines. To the men fighting inside, they were hell. The Red October steelworks became the epicenter of slaughter. Its cavernous halls echoed not with the clang of hammers, but with the roar of gunfire. Germans stormed through the factory floor, rifles blazing, grenades bouncing off rusted machinery. Soviet defenders waited in ambush among twisted girders, crouching behind broken lathes, hiding inside collapsed furnaces. Combat was fought at ranges so close that bayonets, knives, and shovels became deadlier than rifles. Every machine became cover. Conveyor belts shielded machine gun nests. Steel pipes became barricades. The skeletal frames of unfinished tanks became bunkers. Workers who once built weapons now fought beside them, their hands blistered not from tools but from rifles. The factory was not merely defended, it was contested inch by inch. One day, German infantry captured the northern workshops, only to be driven out at night by Soviet counterattacks. Flamethrowers turned storage rooms into infernos. Snipers stalked the catwalks above. Grenades echoed off walls in deafening thunder. Men vanished into shadows and never reappeared. The air inside the Red October was thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic stench of blood. Visibility shrank to meters. Soldiers groped through the dark, fighting by instinct, killing by touch. Corpses piled among the machinery, their blood mixing with the oil and grease that stained the concrete floors. Rats feasted openly, unafraid of the living. To the Germans, the factories were nightmares that refused to fall. For every hall captured, another Soviet detachment appeared from tunnels, sewers, or across the Volga. Reinforcements slipped into the ruins at night, carrying rifles, Molotovs, and grenades. Civilians who once labored in these halls carried ammunition, bricked up defenses, and hauled water to the wounded. General Chukov turned the factories into citadels. His orders were simple: hold at all costs. Retreat was not permitted. Soldiers clung to positions until nothing remained of their units, then new men replaced them. For the Soviets, the ruins of the factories were more than strongholds, they were symbols. If the Red October still stood, Stalingrad still lived. The Germans called the factory fighting inhuman, a descent into madness. Their panzers were useless in the rubble. Artillery only added to the chaos. To take a single workshop might cost hundreds of men. Entire battalions disappeared into the brick and smoke. And yet, still they pressed forward. Hitler demanded it. Paulus obeyed. The factories bled both armies dry. By November, the Red October steelworks was a graveyard of iron and flesh. The Germans believed they were grinding down the last Soviet defenders. They believed the city was finally within their grasp. But what they did not see, what they could not yet imagine, was that the Soviet High Command had prepared something far greater than defense. As the factories burned, beyond the horizon, an army was gathering. Amid the endless ruins of Stalingrad, one building became a legend. It was an ordinary four-story apartment block, overlooking a square near the Volga. To the Germans, it was just another obstacle. To the Soviets, it became a fortress that embodied the defiance of an entire city. History would remember it as Pavlov's house. The story began in late September 1942, when Sergeant Yakov Pavlov led a platoon to recapture the building from German forces. The assault was swift and brutal, grenades hurled through windows, bayonets clashing in stairwells, rifles barking in the smoke. When the dust cleared, Pavlov and his men held the building. They swore they would never give it up. What followed was one of the most remarkable defenses of the battle. For nearly 2 months, Pavlov's platoon and reinforcements turned the apartment block into a fortress. They bricked up windows, dug trenches around the perimeter, and rigged machine gun nests to cover every approach. Mines littered the square. Snipers occupied the upper floors, their scopes fixed on German positions across the street. From the basement to the rooftop, every inch of Pavlov's house was prepared for war. The Germans assaulted again and again. Tanks rolled toward the square, only to be crippled by anti-tank rifles fired from the windows. Infantry charged, only to be cut down by machine gun fire sweeping the approaches. Mortars and artillery smashed the building daily, tearing chunks from its walls, but the defenders clung to the ruins. Pavlov himself joked that the Germans lost more men trying to take his house than they had in capturing Paris. The defenders lived like moles. Supplies were ferried across the Volga at night, ammunition, food, and sometimes even replacements. Water was drawn under fire from a well just meters away, soldiers crawling on their stomachs to fill buckets while bullets snapped overhead. The men slept in shifts, often with rifles still in their hands, waking to the thunder of another assault. Inside the house, life was raw survival. The stench of smoke and blood filled the rooms. Dust choked the air. Rats crawled over the dead in the cellar. Yet morale held. Letters scrawled on scraps of paper spoke not of despair, but of pride. They knew they were part of something larger than themselves. Pavlov's house became a symbol of Soviet resistance. Radio broadcasts spread the story across the front. To Stalin, it was propaganda gold, a demonstration that even a handful of determined men could defy the might of the German army. To the soldiers fighting elsewhere in Stalingrad, it was a beacon. If Pavlov's men could hold, so could they. The Germans, humiliated, could never fully take the building. Assault after assault bled them dry. By November, the apartment block was little more than a shell, its walls riddled with holes, its interior blackened by fire. But it still stood. And more importantly, its defenders still held. When the tide of battle finally turned, when Soviet forces launched their great counteroffensive, Pavlov's house was still in Soviet hands. It had survived the storm. In the grand scale of Stalingrad, with its millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and endless rivers of blood, the defense of one apartment block might seem small. But symbols matter. And Pavlov's house was more than a building. It was defiance made of brick and blood. The Germans had tried to break the spirit of Stalingrad. Instead, one house, held by one platoon, had broken theirs. By October 1942, the Germans controlled most of Stalingrad. The Volga's western bank had become a thin strip of Soviet territory, a ribbon of ruins battered daily by artillery and bombs. Paulus's Sixth Army had driven the defenders into pockets barely wide enough to cling to the river. To the outside world, it looked as though the Red Army was finished. But the Soviets were not finished. The Germans encircled the city from three sides, squeezing it like a vice. Bridges across the Volga were shattered, ferries bombed, docks reduced to rubble. Still, at night, under smoke and darkness, Soviet boats crossed the river. Reinforcements poured in not in divisions but in fragments, companies, platoons, even single squads. They arrived armed with little more than rifles and grenades, sometimes with nothing at all, told to scavenge weapons from the fallen. The Germans pressed harder. Factories were reduced to rubble heaps. The tractor plant was captured, lost, then captured again. Streets became graveyards, alleys filled with frozen corpses. The Sixth Army believed they were closing the noose, grinding down the last of Stalin's defenders. Yet inside the city, General Chukov refused to yield. His men held on, their lines pressed against the Volga itself. In some sectors, the distance between German and Soviet positions was less than 30 meters. Soldiers could hear the enemy talking, coughing, even shivering in the night. At times, both sides hurled grenades back and forth across courtyards like grotesque games. German commanders reported to Paulus that the Soviets could not possibly last much longer. Ammunition must be running out, food must be gone, morale must be shattered. But they underestimated the resolve of a city that had already endured the impossible. Civilians, still trapped in cellars, rationed scraps of bread and dried horse meat. Soldiers fought on with rifles held together by wire and tape. The Germans tried to starve them out. They pounded the riverbanks with artillery, hoping to sever the flow of reinforcements. But each night, the Volga defied them. Smoke, fog, and sheer Soviet stubbornness carried men across. The lifeline remained unbroken. And while the Germans celebrated their victories in the heart of the city, far away on the steppe, Soviet generals were planning something else entirely. Stalin had reinforced his southern front with entire armies, masked from German eyes. While Paulus drove deeper into the ruins, his flanks, stretched thin and guarded by weaker Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions, remained exposed. But Paulus did not see the danger. Hitler did not allow him to. Orders from the Führer were clear: capture Stalingrad, hold it, and crush the enemy at any cost. Retreat was forbidden. The Sixth Army was to fight until the city fell. Inside the ruins, Chukov's men clung to life. They dug shelters into the frozen earth. They fought from sewers, basements, and chimneys. They fired rifles until their barrels warped with heat, then picked up the weapons of the dead. They were starving, freezing, exhausted, but unbroken. The Germans had encircled Stalingrad. But the defenders refused to die. And while Paulus pressed forward unaware, The Soviets were preparing to encircle him. As autumn gave way to winter, Stalingrad changed again. The blazing inferno of August and September gave way to a different torment: ice, snow, and suffocating cold. The Volga, once a river of fire and blood, began to freeze. Its dark waters thickened into slabs of ice, groaning under the weight of artillery shells. The smoke that had once blackened the skyline gave way to frost that bit into the lungs of every soldier. For the Red Army, the freezing river was both curse and blessing. The ferries that had carried men and supplies under fire now struggled against drifting ice. Boats cracked against frozen sheets. Men fell into the water and froze before they could even drown. Yet the ice also gave the Soviets new opportunities. Supplies could be dragged across on sledges at night. Reinforcements crept over in silence, boots muffled against snow. The Volga remained a lifeline, frozen but not broken. Inside the city, the defenders endured misery beyond imagination. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Soldiers huddled in ruins, their breath forming clouds in the dark. They burned furniture, books, even scraps of clothing to keep warm. Some gnawed on frozen horse meat or boiled belts to make broth. Hunger was constant, gnawing merciless. But the cold also became a weapon. German soldiers, who had prepared for a summer victory, lacked proper winter clothing. Their uniforms, designed for quick campaigns in Western Europe, offered little protection against Russian frost. Boots cracked in the ice. Soldiers wrapped themselves in curtains, tablecloths, and scavenged rags. Frostbite crippled entire units. Still, Paulus drove them forward. The Sixth Army continued to assault the riverbank, determined to break the final Soviet holdouts. German artillery pounded the frozen Volga, hoping to shatter its ice and sever the supply line. But the Soviets adapted, crossing under cover of night, blending with snow and smoke, hauling crates of ammunition across their frozen artery. The fighting within the city grew even more desperate. Ruins now lay buried under snowdrifts. Soldiers fought in white camouflage, ghosts stalking each other through frost-coated streets. Machine guns froze solid. Grenades failed to detonate. Men killed with knives, shovels, and bare hands, anything to survive in the frozen labyrinth. Despite their suffering, the Soviets clung to the western bank. Chukov's headquarters itself was a bunker carved into the riverbank, constantly shelled, constantly shaken, but never destroyed. From this icy tomb, he directed the defense, urging his men to hold a line so thin it seemed impossible. The Germans, too, were stretched to breaking. Their supply lines ran hundreds of kilometers across the frozen steppe, vulnerable to Soviet partisans and the endless Russian winter. Fuel shortages crippled tanks and trucks. Horses died in the snow. Men went days without hot food. And yet, Hitler's orders allowed no retreat, no pause. Stalingrad must fall. But the city refused to die. The defenders endured, the Volga endured, and beyond the horizon, the Soviets were gathering strength. By November, the Volga was a frozen artery of survival. The Germans saw only a starving, shivering enemy clinging to scraps of ice. What they did not see was that this very endurance was part of a larger plan. The Red Army had bled in the ruins long enough. Now, with winter tightening its grip, Stalin's generals were ready. The hunters were about to become the hunted. November 19th, 1942. The steppe trembled. At dawn, the quiet broke with a roar. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire in unison. The artillery barrage was so vast that German soldiers later swore the earth itself seemed to crack apart. Shells screamed across the frozen plains, smashing trenches, ripping apart vehicles, and tearing through men. The ground shook as though giants were striking it with hammers. This was not defense. This was vengeance. For months, the Red Army had bled in the ruins of Stalingrad, clinging to a strip of riverbank, sacrificing countless lives. All the while, Soviet generals had been preparing a blow in secret. Operation Uranus, the code name for the great counteroffensive. The trap. The Germans, obsessed with capturing the city, had overextended themselves. Their Sixth Army and Fourth Panzer Army were deep in the ruins, locked in brutal house-to-house combat. Their flanks, stretching hundreds of kilometers across the steppe, were held not by elite German divisions but by their allies. Romanians to the north and south, Italians and Hungarians stretched thin. Poorly armed, ill-equipped for the Russian winter, and demoralized, they were the weak links in Hitler's chain. And the Soviets struck them with fury. On the northern steppe, General Vatutin's forces surged forward. Waves of infantry, tanks, and cavalry poured across the snow, smashing into the Romanian Third Army. T-34s plowed through trenches, crushing barbed wire and men alike. The Romanians broke within hours, their lines dissolving into chaos. To the south, General Yeremenko's Stalingrad front attacked the Romanian Fourth Army. Soviet tanks swept over the steppe in long, endless columns, their turrets flashing in the dawn light. Romanian soldiers, freezing and underarmed, tried to resist, but they were overwhelmed. Their anti-tank weapons were useless against the Soviet armor. Panic spread. Units disintegrated. In 2 days, the Soviet pincers advanced over 30 kilometers. Like jaws snapping shut, the northern and southern offensives drove toward each other. German commanders realized too late what was happening. Their allies were collapsing. Their own flanks were crumbling. And Paulus's Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was still locked inside the ruins of Stalingrad. By November 23rd, the trap closed at the town of Kalach. Soviet tank columns met and linked hands. The encirclement was complete. The hunters of Stalingrad were now prey, sealed inside a steel ring. The Germans were stunned. Hitler had promised them victory, had sworn the Soviets were on the verge of collapse. Instead, they were surrounded. Paulus reported the disaster to headquarters, but Hitler's orders were clear. Hold Stalingrad. The Sixth Army will not retreat a single step, the Führer declared. It will be supplied by air. The promise was madness. The Luftwaffe could never deliver enough supplies to sustain an army trapped in a frozen city. But Hitler would not bend. Paulus obeyed. The Sixth Army dug in, waiting for salvation that would never come. For the Soviets, the tide had turned. The defenders of the city, starved and freezing, suddenly realized they had not been fighting in vain. Their sacrifice had been the bait. Now the jaws had snapped shut. The Battle of Stalingrad was no longer about holding a strip of ruins. It had become something greater, the annihilation of an entire German army. And inside the ring, the nightmare was only beginning. The jaws had closed. 300,000 men of the German Sixth Army, along with remnants of Allied units, were trapped inside Stalingrad. The hunters of summer had become prey in winter. At first, Paulus and his officers believed the encirclement could be broken. The Sixth Army was battle-hardened, disciplined, and still armed with tanks, artillery, and machine guns. If they struck quickly, they might cut their way out to the west. Paulus himself hinted at the possibility in his reports. But Hitler forbade it. The Sixth Army will stand fast, he thundered from his headquarters in East Prussia. It will be supplied by air. The order was final. Paulus obeyed. His chance to escape vanished. The Luftwaffe now carried the burden of survival. Göring boasted he could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day. In reality, even under perfect conditions, the transports could barely manage a fraction. Weather, Soviet fighters, and anti-aircraft fire cut down the stream of aircraft. Cargo planes landed in smoking ruins, unloaded crates of bread and ammunition, and departed under fire. Many never returned. The Sixth Army needed hundreds of tons of supplies each day. They received barely a tenth. Hunger crept in. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Soldiers boiled belts and boots to stave off starvation. Ammunition dwindled, fuel dried up. Yet the orders from Berlin never changed: hold Stalingrad. The Soviets tightened the ring. Entire armies now encircled the city, pressing in from every direction. Supply drops grew even riskier. Airfields outside the pocket were seized, cutting off what little lifeline remained. The trapped Germans were slowly suffocating. Inside Stalingrad, the once proud army began to unravel. Frostbite blackened skin. Men froze in their trenches. Lice spread disease. Soldiers scavenged abandoned cellars for scraps of food. Letters home carried desperation. "We are starving. If help does not come, we will die here." Still Paulus obeyed. He could not disobey Hitler, and Hitler would not permit retreat. The Sixth Army fought on, not for victory but for survival. Meanwhile, the Soviets pressed their advantage. The defenders of Stalingrad, once clinging to a sliver of ruins, now struck back. Chukhov's men launched counterattacks, pushing the enemy deeper into despair. Soviet artillery pounded German positions day and night. Snipers returned to their deadly work, picking off men too weak to resist. The Germans had entered Stalingrad as conquerors. Now they lived like rats, burrowing into cellars, hiding from the cold, gnawing at whatever scraps they could find. They had become what they once despised. By December, their only hope was relief. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a desperate attempt, Operation Winter Storm, to break through to the trapped Sixth Army. German armored divisions surged forward, fighting brutal battles on the frozen steppe. For a moment, it seemed salvation might arrive. But Paulus never moved. He remained in the city, awaiting orders to break out. Hitler refused to give them. "The Sixth Army will stand or die at Stalingrad," he insisted. Winter Storm collapsed. The relief force withdrew. The Sixth Army was alone. The hunters had become the hunted. And now, the noose would tighten until there was nothing left. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army was starving to death. The iron ring around Stalingrad had closed tight. Soviet armies pressed from every direction, squeezing the pocket smaller each day. What had once been a vast force of tanks, artillery, and disciplined infantry was now a hollow shell, barely able to move, barely able to fight. The soldiers of Paulus's army endured misery beyond comprehension. Their rations shrank to almost nothing. Black bread mixed with sawdust. A handful of horse meat shared among squads. Soup made from frozen potato peels. Hunger gnawed until men could no longer stand. Some resorted to eating dogs, even the leather of their belts. Starvation hollowed their faces, turned their eyes into glassy sockets. The cold was merciless. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Men wrapped themselves in rags, curtains, and tablecloths to ward off frostbite. Weapons froze solid, boots cracked in the ice. Frost claimed fingers and toes, leaving soldiers crippled before a shot was fired. Disease spread. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia. Lice infested every uniform. Wounded men lay in overcrowded cellars, groaning in the dark, with no medicine, no bandages, no hope. The field hospitals were charnel houses, where the stench of rot mixed with gunpowder and smoke. And still the Soviets pounded them. Artillery shelled the pocket day and night. The Luftwaffe tried to fly in supplies, but it was hopeless. Soviet fighters hunted the skies, Soviet flak ripped transports apart. Each plane that landed carried only a fraction of what was needed. Too often they returned empty, if they returned at all. Paulus sent desperate radio messages to Berlin. He reported shortages of food, ammunition, fuel. He begged for orders to break out. But Hitler remained unmoved. "The Sixth Army will hold its ground," he commanded. "Surrender is out of the question." So the Sixth Army dug deeper, fighting on instinct, driven by desperation. Entire companies melted away in days. A division that had once numbered 15,000 men now counted fewer than 1,000 able to fight. The Soviets advanced relentlessly, tightening the noose. Each district of Stalingrad became a killing ground. Chukhov's soldiers, once fighting for scraps of rubble, now pressed the enemy back step by step. They retook the factories, stormed the ruins, shattered what remained of the German defenses. Inside the pocket, morale collapsed. Some officers clung to discipline, trying to hold order among starving men. Others surrendered themselves to despair. Suicide spread in the ranks. Soldiers scrawled farewell notes in the margins of their diaries before pulling the trigger. And yet, even in this nightmare, the Germans fought with a kind of stubborn fury. They had no choice. For them, there was no retreat, no salvation. Only the promise of death, by bullet, by starvation, or by frost. The once proud Sixth Army, Hitler's spearhead on the Eastern Front, had become a mass of walking skeletons. They were no longer an army. They were a tragedy waiting for its final act. And the Soviets were ready to end it. As the Sixth Army starved in Stalingrad, their only enemy more merciless than the Red Army was Adolf Hitler himself. From his distant headquarters, the Führer issued commands like iron bars slammed across a cell. He would not accept retreat. He would not accept reality. He rebranded disaster with a single word: Festung. Fortress. Stalingrad was to be held to the last cartridge. The city, already a graveyard, was renamed a symbol. Symbols do not surrender. Symbols do not move. Men do. And they died for it. Göring promised salvation from the sky. 500 tons a day, he boasted. Enough bread. Enough fuel. Enough ammunition. Staff officers winced. Pilots stared at the maps and said nothing. The winter sky said everything. Snow. Ice fog. Soviet fighters hunting the lanes. Flak blackening the air over the last usable strips, Potomnik, then Gumrak. Transports limped in under fire, landed on smoking runways, dumped crates, clawed back into the clouds, if they could. Many did not. The daily average never came close. Hunger did. In Berlin, General Kurt Zeitzler fought the numbers like a man drowning fights the river. He begged for a breakout. Let them move now, before the ring hardens. He even cut his own rations to match a soldier's in the pocket, a protest on a plate. It changed nothing. Hitler clung to a fantasy born in the forests of Demyansk the winter before, when airlift had kept a smaller pocket alive. He tried to replay the trick against a larger enemy, over longer distances, in deeper winter, under hostile skies. Strategy by superstition. Paulus felt the vice closing. His reports grew colder, more clinical, more desperate. Ammunition low. Fuel critical. Rations inadequate. The sick list longer than the roster of the fit. Yet his tone remained obedient. He was a staff general, methodical, loyal, taught to execute orders, not rewrite them. The Führer commands, he told subordinates. The words tasted like frost. Soviet pressure squeezed the airfields first. Potomnik fell. Gumrak followed. With each loss, the airlift bled out another artery. Now the wounded could not be flown out. Now the dead stayed where they fell, snow-covered, rigid, anonymous. The last landings took place on strips gouged from ruin, where a plane might touch down and never rise again. Ground crews worked with numb hands, loading thin cargoes into bellies that once carried plenty. A handful of flour. A coil of wire. A box of morphine that was already too late. Hitler's directives hardened as the pocket shrank. Hold every street. Defend every cellar. Surrender forbidden. Breakout forbidden. He threw promises like lifelines that never reached the drowning. Reinforcements forming, relief in motion, the front stabilizing. Manstein's Wintergewitter clawed forward and stalled in the blizzards west of the Don. Stand fast, Hitler repeated. Relief is coming. It wasn't. Inside the ruins, officers argued in whispers. Break out and face court-martial later? Or obey and let thousands freeze in place? The choice was no choice at all. The army was too weak, the tanks too empty, the men too starved to run anywhere but into snow and guns. The moment for a breakout had passed with November. Orders had kept it from being taken. January came like a verdict. Soviet artillery spoke first, concentric rings of fire, deliberate, methodical, reducing the pocket as an executioner tightens rope. Chukov pressed from the riverbank. Rokossovsky drove from the steppe. The Sixth Army bent. It did not break. It simply thinned to transparency. Then the final insult from the distant throne. January 30th, 1943, anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. A radio message crossed the frozen air and slid into a basement headquarters beneath a shattered department store. Friedrich Paulus was promoted to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever capitulated. The sentence inside the accolade was clear as a pistol on a desk. Die rather than yield. Paulus read the message. He looked at the wreckage of his command, at the wounded stacked in stairwells, at the last cartridges counted like prayer beads. He did not raise a hand to his temple. He did not raise a gun. He lowered his eyes and prepared to do something no field marshal had done before. Hitler's orders had turned a victory into a siege into a famine into a funeral. The fortress was a fiction sustained by corpses. The last act was ready. On January 10th, Soviet guns had opened the curtain on Operation Ring. Now they would close it. The end would come room by room, cellar by cellar, heartbeat by heartbeat. January 1943. The pocket had withered into fragments. What had once been the proud Sixth Army was now scattered clusters of half-dead men, crouched in ruins, wrapped in rags, their rifles empty, their stomachs hollow. Stalingrad, once promised as a jewel of conquest, had become their tomb. On January 10th, the Red Army opened the final act. Operation Ring. Thousands of guns thundered at once, their shells falling in a rolling wave that moved like a storm across the pocket. German trenches dissolved. Command posts shattered. Men were buried alive in snow and rubble. The ground shook for hours until silence fell, broken only by the advance of Soviet infantry. The Soviets pressed relentlessly, reducing the pocket piece by piece. Entire German regiments surrendered, too weak to resist. Others fought to the last cartridge, huddled in cellars, machine guns rattling until barrels ran dry. Snipers and grenadiers moved through streets that had once been German strongholds, now little more than icy graves. Paulus's army split in two. To the north, General Strecker commanded the remnants of 11 Corps, holding on in frozen ruins around the factory district. To the south, Paulus himself sat in his headquarters beneath a ruined department store in the city center. Between them, Soviet armies carved through the ruins, isolating pockets, crushing resistance in methodical sweeps. In some basements, Germans burned their last maps and flags. In others, men huddled together, delirious from hunger, waiting for the Soviets to come. Some tried to break through the lines in small groups, but most were cut down in the snow. Their tracks were easy to follow, their strength too far gone. The Soviets advanced with grim determination. They knew the end was near. Chukov's men, once defenders of the riverbank, now surged forward as avengers. Red banners were raised on buildings that had been battlegrounds for months. Soldiers cheered, then moved on, clearing another ruin, another trench, another cellar filled with gaunt figures too weak to fight. For the Germans, there was no hope left. They had no food, no fuel, no air support, no chance of relief. Hitler's promises had vanished like smoke in the winter sky. Their last stand was not a glorious defense, but a slow disintegration. And yet, pockets of defiance remained. At the tractor factory, German machine gunners fought until overrun. In a burned-out schoolhouse, a group of officers made a final stand, firing pistols and throwing grenades until silence consumed them. These were not victories, only gestures against the inevitable. By January 25th, the Sixth Army had collapsed into isolated islands of resistance. Paulus reported the situation. Our troops are at the end of their strength. Ammunition and food are exhausted. Collapse is inevitable. He asked again for permission to surrender. Hitler ignored him. The last days were filled with silence, punctuated by sudden violence. Starving soldiers too weak to lift rifles simply sat in the snow and waited for capture. Others clutched their weapons until Soviet troops tore them away. Entire battalions surrendered en masse, their officers too broken to protest. The last stand of the Sixth Army was not a charge or a rally. It was the slow death of an army devoured by frost, hunger, and the iron grip of an enemy who had learned patience. And in the city center, beneath the ruins, a field marshal waited. The moment of surrender was at hand. January 31st, 1943. The city of Stalingrad was silent, eerily, unnaturally silent. The thunder of artillery had faded. The rattle of rifles had stopped. Only the crunch of Soviet boots in snow marked the end of the bloodiest battle in human history. In the basement of a shattered department store on Red Square, Friedrich Paulus sat hunched over a table. Around him, the wreckage of an army. His staff officers, pale and hollow-eyed, scribbled notes that no longer mattered. Outside, the men of the Sixth Army waited without orders, too weak to fight, too weak even to hope. Then the sound came, heavy footsteps descending into the cellar. Soviet officers entered, their faces grim, their words curt. The war, at least here, was finished. Paulus did not raise his pistol. He did not stand defiant. He did not kill himself, as Hitler had expected. Instead, he listened as the Soviets demanded his surrender. Hours earlier, he had been promoted to Field Marshal, the first in German history to fall into enemy hands. Hitler's message had been clear: no field marshal must ever be captured alive. But Paulus chose life, not death. He surrendered. In that instant, the myth of German invincibility shattered. The greatest field army of the Reich had been destroyed. Across the ruins, surrender spread like fire. German units emerged from cellars with hands raised. Starved soldiers stumbled into the open, dropping their rifles in the snow. Officers tore insignia from their uniforms, ashamed to face captivity. Tens of thousands, skeletal and frostbitten, lined up under Soviet guard. The southern pocket, commanded by Paulus himself, collapsed first. Within days, the northern pocket under General Strecker followed. Strecker's last radio message to Berlin was defiant: a loyal end has been achieved. Long live Germany. Hours later, his corps laid down its arms. The numbers defied comprehension. Of the 300,000 men who had marched into Stalingrad, only about 90,000 remained alive to surrender. Starving, frostbitten, diseased, they began the long march into Soviet captivity. For most, it was a death sentence. Only a fraction, perhaps 5,000, would ever return to Germany, years later, broken and gray. For the Soviets, the victory was total. Red banners flew above the ruins. Stalin proclaimed the triumph to the world. After months of slaughter, sacrifice, and fire, the city that bore his name had not fallen. Instead, it had become the graveyard of Hitler's mightiest army. In Berlin, Hitler raged. He called Paulus a coward, a traitor, unworthy of the rank he had been given. But fury could not hide the truth. The Reich had suffered a defeat it could not conceal, could not spin into glory. The aura of invincibility was gone. The surrender at Stalingrad was more than a military collapse. It was a turning point in the war. The tide had shifted. From this moment on, the Germans would fight on the defensive. The Red Army, bloodied but unbowed, had proven it could not only survive but destroy. The streets of Stalingrad were quiet now. The ruins stood as monuments to suffering and defiance. Beneath the snow, the dead outnumbered the living. Civilians, soldiers, Germans, Soviets, all alike consumed by the furnace of war. But above the silence rose a single truth: Stalingrad had endured. The guns fell silent, but the shockwaves of Stalingrad thundered across the world. For more than 5 months, the German Sixth Army had clawed at the city on the Volga. They had marched in as conquerors, certain of victory, confident in Hitler's dream of a Reich stretching to the Urals. They left as prisoners, corpses, and shadows of men. The surrender of Paulus's army marked more than a defeat. It marked a fracture in the very spine of Nazi Germany. Until Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Blitzkrieg had shattered Poland, France, and the Balkans. Even the Soviet Union, vast and defiant, had reeled under the fury of 1941. German soldiers, hardened and disciplined, carried an aura of invincibility. But the ruins of Stalingrad stripped that aura away. The myth of the unbeatable German army died in the snow. Across the world, the news spread like wildfire. In London and Washington, Stalingrad was hailed as a miracle, a sign that Hitler's tide could be reversed. Allied leaders celebrated the Soviet stand, and propaganda posters shouted the victory as proof that the Reich was bleeding. For the first time, the war seemed winnable. In Berlin, shock gave way to despair. Hitler's voice, once triumphant, now raged with fury and denial. His strategy had been shattered by his own obsession. He had demanded the city's capture at any cost, and the cost had been an entire army. Paulus's surrender humiliated the Führer. His prestige, carefully built on the myth of genius and inevitability, cracked. The generals who once obeyed in silence began to doubt. The German people, though fed propaganda, whispered of disaster. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was not just a victory. It was rebirth. The Red Army, which had staggered under the hammer of 1941, now stood taller. Stalin, once desperate, now wielded confidence. His soldiers, who had clung to life in cellars and fought with bare hands in ruins, had proven they could not only survive but triumph. Strategically, the battle changed everything. Germany lost not just men, but its grip on the east. The destruction of the Sixth Army crippled Hitler's southern front. The dream of reaching the oil fields of the Caucasus was gone forever. From Stalingrad onward, the Wehrmacht would retreat, step by bloody step, across the vastness of Russia, until one day the Red Army would march into Berlin itself. But the price was unimaginable. Over 2 million men had fought in Stalingrad. More than 1 million were dead, wounded, or missing. Civilians who had once called the city home were buried beneath its rubble. The Volga ran thick with the memory of blood. Victory had come, but at a cost so steep it defied comprehension. Still, the meaning was undeniable. Stalingrad was not merely a battle. It was a turning point, a moment when the war shifted, when Hitler's star began to fall, when the Soviets began their relentless march westward. The tide had turned, and the echo of that turn would shake the world until the Reich lay in ruins. The battle was over. But the city was not a city anymore. It was a graveyard. Stalingrad, once an industrial hub on the Volga, had been reduced to rubble and ash. Smoke still curled from collapsed factories. Streets were clogged with frozen corpses, their shapes stiff beneath the snow. Buildings stood as hollow shells, blackened and shattered, with only jagged walls to mark where life once thrived. It was no longer a place to live, but a monument to death. The numbers told only part of the horror. Historians estimate that nearly 2 million men fought in and around Stalingrad. More than 1 million never returned. Entire divisions had ceased to exist, swallowed whole by the furnace. German losses were catastrophic, over 300,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The Soviets paid an even higher price. Nearly 500,000 dead, countless more wounded, and tens of thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. Every street was soaked in sacrifice. Civilians who had once worked in the factories were buried in the ruins of those very buildings. Families died together in cellars, suffocated by flames. Soldiers lay where they fell, on staircases, in trenches in the snow. The city itself had consumed them. Yet from this devastation, victory emerged. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was proof of resilience, proof that even the mightiest enemy could be broken. For the Red Army soldier, the ruins were not just a battlefield but a shrine, a place consecrated by the blood of comrades. The victory was won by those who fought with rifles, knives, shovels, and bare hands, who endured hunger, cold, and fear but did not retreat. For the Germans, the defeat scarred the soul of the Reich. Families waited for sons who would never return. Prisoners marched east into captivity, their bodies hollow, their spirits broken. Few would survive the gulags and the endless winters of Siberia. For those left behind in Germany, Stalingrad became a name spoken in whispers, a symbol of loss, futility, and betrayal by their own Führer. The price of victory was also personal. Survivors carried scars that would never heal. Men who lived through the Rat War in the ruins often spoke of nightmares that lasted a lifetime. Some never spoke at all. The city had consumed a part of them that could never be reclaimed. Stalingrad was the bloodiest battle in human history. It was more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of wills, Hitler's obsession against Stalin's defiance, the Reich's ambition against the Soviet people's survival. And in that collision, humanity paid the highest price imaginable. When the snow finally melted in the spring of 1943, grass grew over mass graves, flowers sprouted among ruins. But the scars of the battle never faded. They still remain today, etched into the memory of nations. Stalingrad had turned the tide of World War II. But it had done so by drowning both victor and vanquished in blood. The city stood, The Soviets triumphed. But the echo of its price, millions dead, millions broken, would haunt history forever.